But while we wait for Prosper, I thought it best that we quickly get the introductions at least out of the way, and for you guys at least to know who's going to sort of give what input. My name is Alex De Vet. I'm a commercial property lawyer / eventually became part of the cannabis industry. I practiced in Lesotho as well as in South Africa. So that's sort of kind of why I'm part of this panel. I'm then going to sort of ask everybody just to introduce themselves, give a 2-minute background on where you feature and what's your area of speciality with regard to Africa. Robby, yeah.
My name is Robby Rorijs. I'm from the Netherlands. I'm active in the Democratic Republic of Congo. I try to run a plantation there. It's a former plantation of greenhouse seeds. So I'm a lot involved with the locals there, as well as with the Congolese government and their authorities for their agencies.
Good day, everybody. My name is Etienne. I'm an anthropologist, and I work in the industrial and development policy space, intersects with the public policy, obviously, and then drug policy is more my passion. In 2023, I was part of the research team to conduct research that was commissioned by the South African Department of Trade and Industry to update the National Cannabis Master Plan, and then I've also done some research for the ISS and GTOP on policy reform in Eastern and Southern Africa.
Hi there, everyone. My name's Neil Carrier. So I'm an anthropologist as well, so we were remarking having that two anthropologists together on this panel. But I'm an anthropologist from the University of Bristol. And for quite a few years I've been involved with Gernot Planchnik over in the back, who spoke on the last panel, on a project called Cannabis Africana, studying cannabis and livelihoods in 4 different countries, so Nigeria, Zimbabwe, South Africa, and Kenya. And Kenya is where I took part in, or conducted most of my research on the project, alongside my Kenyan colleague, Gordon Amenya, who sadly can't be with us today. But yeah, that's how I come into it. And so I'll probably be giving more of a Kenyan perspective, maybe, as we go through the panel. So, thank you.
So hello everybody, I'm Dr. Prosper Sievu from Zambia. I'm the board chairperson for the Cannabis Board in Zambia, and also the CEO of my company, Medical Cannabis Clinics, and also the CEO of the Chiefs Foundation, Royal Highnesses in Zambia, who are 288, and who are also participating in the medical cannabis industry.
Thanks, guys. All right. This particular discussion, as you guys have seen on the program, sort of deals with beyond the legislation and then strengthening institution standards in human capital, with the whole idea of an African cannabis industry. Now, I was part and parcel of Lesotho when they changed their Medicines and Substances Act, which happened quite fast and caught us all, especially the lawyers, kind of unaware. So it literally opened a market for cannabis quite immediately. And sort of part and parcel of it, there was a lot of questions as to how do we deal with it. Yes, the legality has been done. And as we know, in South Africa and other countries in Africa, the legality is done. So legally, the law has been changed. That's the easy part. The question is, how do we take that going forward? How do we take the change in law and commercialize it, not just per country, but also for Africa in general? Lesotho's position was rather simple. They decided to cultivate and export everything. Not a single shred was allowed in the country. So that was their argument. It's not good for their people, but it's good for Europe. So cultivate it, grow it, and then send it away. So that was kind of Lesotho's plan. Obviously South Africa, from the South African context, we've been sort of up and down with constitutional court amendments to law and a new act, and we're sort of all still a bit unsure as to where we stand. So I'm not going to speak on the South African point. I think the reason I was included was merely for Lesotho, but it's rather fast to answer. They just did it, and they sort of changed the regulations as time went by and saw what was the problem, and then just chucked on. The child was ugly, but they got it going. So that's sort of the Lesotho perspective, if I can put it that way. But yes, gentlemen, obviously there's various countries in the countries that you guys are from or operate in. Change the law, but what happens in your countries after that? Robby?
It's like you said, they made a law, but they forgot to implement it. They even forgot to inform their own services. So, for example, the police was not informed that they passed a law, and customs were not informed. So, what you had that parties of cannabis that were being transported were being seized because the policeman saw it, stopped the car, took it away. Negotiate, well, it's Congo, so you pay, and then you have your stuff back. And and even within the competent authorities, so to speak, there was not enough knowledge about the whole subject of cannabis. Nisso mentioned it before, but I did it. It was me who was there in the room when I met the chairman of the CNPC that's ready to apply for your cannabis license. And at our very first meeting, I had to explain to him the difference between CBD and THC, and he's the chairman. So it went on and on, and we have to deal with our quota. That's the pharmaceutical part. There you apply for your import or export documents. And the vice director, the Cordon, he said, it's medical cannabis. That's only until 0.2% THC. So, plus I've pushed the last 2 years. I spent really 2 years of my life doing that to have Congo register itself at the INCB, because they passed a law, but they didn't mention anything in Vienna. So I said, so your documents don't have any value on the international market when you're not registered. So that's basically also next to the fact that I'm trying to run a plantation. I'm also dealing with this, and I asked them many times, please look at the other countries. The problem of that is we are a francophone country, and the rest is anglophone, and that doesn't,
I think
it's a problem.
Yeah,
sometimes.
From a Lesotho perspective, for example, they were registered with the INCB.
Yeah.
Before they changed the legislation, which helped.
Yeah.
So, I know, I get what you're saying. Etienne.
Yeah, so I think it might be useful to give you guys an overview of what legislation and maybe cannabis specifically instruments look like for Eastern and Southern Africa. So I'm drawing here from research that I conducted about a year and a half ago, and so some of this might be out of date by now, specifically in the case of Zambia, where you guys made some progress, but you can tell us more about that. A cohort of about 21 countries in Eastern and Southern Africa. About 9 of them have cannabis specifically with instruments now that was developed out of policy reform. There's this, they've kind of looked at what they want to do with cannabis within 3 segments in the sector. So that would be the industrial, medicinal, and recreational segments. Currently, none of them have adult use trade. But when it comes to medicinal use, there's about 11 countries that have some sort of policy around that. Some of them are still under review, and industrial uses are about the same. So leave it at that. There's obviously more details to the specific complexities pertaining to how they're doing that. But I'll just add that for medicinal use, it's also, I think none of the countries actually have local consumption available for their population. It's mostly for investment and then export. So it's kind of an extraction model rather than benefiting the local population.
Neil, sort of Kenya. I'll be honest with you, I haven't heard much about Kenya's market and their position on the cultivation and distribution of cannabis. Sort of what's the feeling or what's the reality on the ground in Kenya?
In Kenya. Well, it is somewhere that isn't, the kind of beyond legalization doesn't quite work. They are still, as they were in terms of the main drug policies that relate to cannabis in Kenya. But it's kind of it's quite an interesting country to look at. I think for many reasons in relation to cannabis, but how much kind of. I'm taking that phrase like beyond legalization or beyond legislation, maybe in another direction. If you do look beyond what's happening on the legal sphere, where there have been quite a few attempts over the last decade, I would say. There was some quite famous within Kenya attempts to push a cannabis bill, particularly a member of Parliament, Kenneth Koff, who sadly died a few years ago, but was really quite active in trying to push a bill through Parliament to liberalise cannabis. And then famously, quite a few of them may have kept track in the Kenyan elections a few years ago, the presidential elections, where there was one candidate in particular, Wajikoya, who was standing on a platform where he was talking about how the cannabis sector could be, if that could be liberalised, could be an amazing benefit for Kenya. This was part of his electoral strategy, really, to push that through. But then, he came a distant third to the two main candidates in that election. So he got a lot of press coverage about it, a lot of interest, but it didn't really, translate into actual kind of change. And at the moment, as well as interestingly, a case being brought by the Rastafarian Society of Kenya to try and
that's the best YouTube video this year.
Oh, really? Yeah.
You must watch it.
That was amazing, that video.
Yeah, his calmness.
Yeah.
Yes.
And from the lawyers, I thought it was absolutely superb.
Yeah. So there's quite a lot going on to try and push the change. But what I would say is kind of in that idea of beyond legalization is how much, this is perhaps can be more anecdotal. As someone who's been on and off going to Kenya since 1999 for various forms of bits of research, but there's a much more openness about cannabis now. There's a real healthy debate about it in the society at large, I think, which, 10 years ago, there just really wasn't. It was quite buried. And even music, music's quite a good example of this. So many songs that I see coming out of the Kenyan music scene, will feature cannabis quite prominently in a way that I really don't think they would have taken that risk, again, about a decade ago. And there's some quite nice angles that people are pushing as well, like cannabis as, that call to reform the law as almost like an anti-colonial measure, looking back at kind of these prohibition to cannabis in Kenya as being, something that was imposed by the colonials, over 100 years ago. And there's quite, a bit of traction around that as well, that this is something, that we need to do to get past that. So to kind of decolonise the laws in some way in that regard. So, I think that would be my main summation of Kenya, that there's some really interesting initiatives around the legislation and trying to push that, but that you do see that change has come in the, the more cultural, these kind of ways, and more openness around it.
Doctor, good question for our neighbours in Zambia. sort of what's the position in Zambia with regard to the legalization and going further into the value chain?
Okay, thank you for that. In Zambia, we wrote our acts, we started in 2019 and earlier, with the Royal Highnesses of the government. There was impetus from the government. We wrote our laws, the Industrial Hemp Act, and we have what we call the Cannabis Act. So previously we had...
Sorry, can I just interject? Due to a question we had, so Zambia is distinguished between the two.
100%.
So you said,
Yes.
this one and there's that.
Yes.
So, continue.
So previously we had what we call the Dangerous Drugs Act and the Narcotic and Psychotropic Act. In those two acts, we just had one sentence speaking about cannabis. It says cannabis may be obtained by license from the minister. So when we realized that that's a problem, our president repealed through parliament, we repealed the laws and we wrote new acts. So we have separate acts defining what cannabis is, then industrial hemp, and we have what we call the Controlled Substance Act. So what does it mean for the country is that us as medical practitioners can then prescribe. What does it mean for Zambia? Zambia can now put cannabis as part of insurance, right? So cannabis is insured and we treat it as a medicine, part of our regulations. So the Controlled Substance Act is a special, as cannabis is a Schedule 1 drug, but with the powers of the minister, we are now classified as part of medicine and where we can use insurance to pay for cannabis. So there has been quite a lot of transformation of our laws in Zambia, and we have taken deliberate action through the Ministry of Health. So right now we do have the board, and it's an 11-member board. I'm the board chairperson. So the Ministry of Health is the lead, and we have Zamra, which is like SAFRA here in South Africa, and we have other wings of government to support the drug enforcement. We have the military and the home affairs. We have the security wings, part of the board, to help enforce, the rule of law, and also to promote, cannabis in Zambia. We also have the universities that are part of research. You'll be happy to know that we have 280 chiefs in Zambia that have come together, and we had what we call an amnesty of seeds. We helped bring all the local strains to a herbarium in Lusaka so that we can understand what our cultivars or strains we have locally to see how we can, develop our strains. So there has been a lot of push for the past 5 years, and our board was just formed last year. And in August, after our elections, we'll be running our clinics and also obviously doing expos, and also investors are welcome to come to Zambia.
No, I can understand why. Etienne, from a South African perspective, the good doctor gave a very good outline of what Zambia is doing in order to especially try to manage cannabis in a sort of a safe and practical way, subject to the law. In South Africa, where do you think we're going?
Well, that's quite a complex question. I think we've probably got a good enough evidence base if we look at data that's been collected by the South African Medical Research Council. They've been doing collecting private immunological data since they started, right? The drug unit that focuses specifically on that, and then cannabis is a category under drugs for them to collect that. But interestingly, since 2018, we've obviously now generated new data, and it shows again that there's no increase, a statistical relevant increase in rehabilitation uptake for cannabis-related substance use problems, which just to speak to the evidence base. But with regards to formalizing policy, it's an ongoing battle. Again, I'll probably pull John into this since he's engaging in that much more closely at this point. It's still an uphill battle. I think we've got probably consensus on the harms of cannabis and that it's really not such a big issue, especially if you compare it with other substances that are regulated and readily available, like tobacco and alcohol. But there's something else that's stopping us from actually making those decisions, and it seems to be more political, so rooted in the political economy and political capital available to actually exercise the will to say, yes, we want to go forward with this is what we want the industry to look like, and this is, the suggested routes which will enable it. But as to when we'll see that, that remains to be seen. And even putting John on the spot, I don't think even he's going to be able to give us really any clarity on that. But I mean, if you want to add something, I'd be. That's it. I think many people sitting in this room follow Consultancy quite closely, and we know it seems like it's just moving. There's some things that are moving behind the scenes, but that's what we'll get. The government's pretty opaque. Still in that regard, so it's really hard to say.
Robby, from a DRC perspective, is there sort of any good news perhaps on the horizon when it comes to a proper cannabis sector?
No, but it has to come from ourselves. So it has to, sadly enough, it has to come from the commercial sector itself to private sector. Yeah, because government is not promoting it. They want it, but they made the entry level so high. For example, you have 3 levels of licenses to go and produce cannabis. The first costs $500,000. The second costs $2 million, and the third costs $3 million. So with that, they build up a barrier that no local can ever get that license unless your uncle is in the government. Well, some of them have uncles in the government, so they acquired a license. We, on the other hand, we just made a deal with them. And listen, man, normally we would get a tax break, but we can pay tax. So that took a really long time for them to take a decision on. So we had to, let's call it neutral, motivate some of the decision makers on that as well. But no, it really has to come from us. And still, we have to teach them. It sounds stupid, but it's the truth.
Yeah, no, I'm glad you sort of touched on the barrier of entry. In Lesotho, it was more or less the same situation. You actually had to first deposit money before you were issued a license.
Yeah.
Once that has been done into the coffers of the necessary department of Ministry of Health, you would be issued a license. Now, Prosper, Zambia, how does your system work with regard to entry into the market? I know we all know that South Africa has a relatively high barrier of entry. It costs a lot of money to really get into the industry and the sector. But in Zambia, how do you guys approach that?
Okay, so through our head of state, we were given impetus and authority to rewrite, the fees and the regulations. So we have full regulations. The initial startup was $250,000 initially, and for medical cannabis, we brought it down to $5,000. We brought industrial hemp from also $250,000 to $1,000.
Sure.
Yeah. So the reason why we brought down the fees is we are looking at industrial hemp, especially industrial hemp, as this industrial crop. How can we get the women and those who are employed, train them, and with all the land which we have in Zambia, 100,000 hectares of land have been given from the Royal Highnesses to the people in order to cultivate industrial hemp, and the land is also carbon credited. So we brought the fees down so that we can help people access, the project, so to say. And through cooperatives, people can come together. We can train people in various skills and help them, get the knowledge and also create the value chain through education. So the entry level is low, but obviously the key factors like knowledge and the ability to understand what the crop can do for the economy. Yeah.
Well, that's a very good point that you touch on, because it's something that one has to discuss at some point in time. Lesotho, for example, there is total restriction on any consumption or sale within the borders of the country. So you were allowed to cultivate, but it had to go. We all know, here comes the discussion about standards. Everybody knows EU, GMP, etc., etc. From a Lesotho perspective, they just had to ensure that the facilities were compliant. Now, your barrier of entry is lower than, I would say, probably Lesotho or South Africa. How do you guys juggle that? The low barrier of entry versus high standard of product.
Okay. So it's the issue of education. We have now policies, even myself, government has given us free will. Right now I'm doing my PhD in medical cannabis. Okay, so I'm on a sabbatical as we speak right now, and it's about research, cannabis with cancer, how to use cannabinoids in cancer, cannabinoids in neurological diseases like epilepsy. So we are able to do, clinical trials. So when the barrier is a little bit lower, and players like myself can go into the system, we can create research and data which then can be marketed to the international, economies and players. So if we restrict people, we won't be able to then, do studies and research. And I think it's what makes it easy for us and myself is policy. If the policy makers give us the technocrats the leeway to craft documents and policies, it makes it easier for people to thrive in such an environment.
To add something to that, so it's very interesting to see the developments in Zambia, because so I was at a conference in Mozambique. It was a regional drug policy conference, right? The cannabis was a specific focus there, and I actually spoke to your head of narcotics, and he was very reluctant at all to share much information, but he also just flat out said, we're not going to entertain this cannabis thing. They might think about foreign investment to grow cannabis for medicinal purposes, and then it gets grown and it's out. It's not local, but see the development is quite interesting. I'm curious if you can add something on what changed there, because obviously there was government opinion on this, and obviously there's potential for you guys to achieve what you have.
Yes, so we had a previous government before 2021 where we just had the draft laws. When the new government came in through my Minister of Health, they gave us the impetus to move the program forward. So what happened is that in 2021, the draft bills were then signed into law. Okay, then we were able to form the board itself, and then obviously this is where we drafted now our regulations, which stipulates all the fees and the ability to create a local industry. So we're not focusing on the European market, but the local industry. How can industrial hemp build better roads? How can industrial hemp go into the textiles? How can industrial hemp go into car manufacturing locally? How do we use medical cannabis to treat cancer? How do we use medical cannabis locally? We have a huge local market. We are 20 million Zambians. 5 million of our people are already on private insurance. So there is your market. If we build industries, we can buy from ourselves, and the surplus can then be exported. But we're looking at the cannabis industry to grow locally, and then also to create medical tourism. We have 9 bordering countries that do not have functioning laws, so to say, and they can come and participate in our research.
Okay, so there was a change in leadership, and then I guess the political constituency played a role in
also helping to affect that change, because it was a different party before that had a different opinion.
Maybe can I add to that question? Was it a political issue in the elections that brought about the change in government?
That's what I was about to ask.
Sorry. Yeah.
No, don't worry.
Yeah, it wasn't issues of, it was a policy issue. So in the previous government, as I mentioned, we had bills. When they saw it was a transition, in the next government, those bills were made law. So the initial impetus, so to say, started from the previous government to the new government. And when the new government came in, we then formed our regulation and formed our board. Yeah.
Okay, but maybe Alexis, to you, in the elections, was it an issue? Were the differences between the two main parties over cannabis, or was it a non-issue?
In the politics, it was not an issue. It wasn't something which was debated on political grounds, or people used it as a linchpin in their campaign messages. No, it was not that. So what we did is that it came back to us as Ministry of Health and, technocrats who understood the subject. We are given the seat, so to say, to make those decisions.
Neil, from a Kenyan sort of perspective, what Zambia is doing a lot to really give it a go, and Kenya, you said it's starting but not starting. What do you think the future is going to hold for Kenya?
Oh, it's a really good question. I mean, there are quite a lot of various interests but do hold back the change at the moment. It's also quite a lot of the debate, especially around that election with Wajikuya, and his campaign around industrial hemp. There was a lot of pushback from the church, and there was a bit of a sense as well that Wajikuya's campaign seemed a bit too outlandish, so it might have made the issue the issue of cannabis seem quite outlandish itself. So almost like a bit of a novelty issue. So there's some debate about whether that campaign as well might have push that debate a bit. But I do get the sense there is a bit of a wait and see attitude being taken within Kenya, to see how in other countries how this is going to play out. Certainly from conferences we held as part of the project, that seems to be the sense. Like there's a main agency around drug policy called NACADA in Kenya. And I remember one of their officials really wanted to know, proper research about what's happening in South Africa, for example, after all the changes here and probably, other countries as well. So I think there is a sense that Kenya is holding back a bit, but then another sense of people that, maybe other people having the FOMO, fear of missing out as, other countries move in this direction, that maybe Kenya is missing out in this way. But yeah, still quite a lot of things holding it back, I would say.
Can I just add to that? So, again, during that conference, obviously we had a bunch of African countries there, and there were some good presentations made, good conversations had. But when asked what they might do in the future regarding the policy reform for cannabis, it also seemed like a lot of them were just looking at one another in the room and seeing who's going to make the first move, who's going to do what. I think a lot of people were receptive to the idea of reforming cannabis laws, but they seem to lack the confidence to really commit to saying, yes, we can confidently do this. We believe that it is something we should be doing. I'll leave it at that.
Well, can I ask a question?
Yeah.
So I was hoping there's some Ghanaians in the room, but they're not here, and they're being very vocal about what they're doing, but it seems to be an export market approach. And I'm really interested in Ghana versus Zambia, and I'm Team Zambia.
Well, interesting is I had some discussions with representatives from Ghana, right, and they were actually very keen to see how they can enable the cannabis sector, but they were very unsure about things like thresholds for hemp, and for how you regulate medicinal cannabis and
the people who were coming with the business association for hemp and she headed up the commodities exchange. So I get the sense that it's all about creating markets to export and build on investment, but rather than the Zambian approach, which is all about investing in your local knowledge base and economy, and just the insurance thing and medical is just way ahead of the rest of the planet.
We from Galvin, one of my companies, we have studied how to enter Ghana. We need some local, because you can, as a foreigner you cannot go in. What I thought, that is my thought, that law is dictated by the DEA.
Okay, one of those.
And like literally, and I think that they could print the DEA logo under it in that way.
Well, they have been in the US visiting people. So
and
I get there's a sense of a lot of US policy.
DEA was there. We even speaking about 2022, we had a DEA person from the embassy of the US embassy in Kinshasa as well, inviting people from even they invited one of the persons who already had a license,
That's a really interesting insight, because the DEA are holding hearings at the moment, and they're only letting people in those hearings who are anti-cannabis talk, and they're holding them behind closed doors. And so if they're introducing those concepts, those political ideas into African governments, I think it's something African governments should be very aware of.
Yeah, and something to add to that is when it comes to policy and how that is the relationship between policy and financial assistance that comes from countries like the US, it actually shapes a lot of their local policy for drugs. We see that in Nigeria, we see that in places like Ghana as well. So again, it's the thinking and the autonomy. It's not theirs to really dictate always, because it's a case of now, okay, we decided to change policies that contradict the basis of the support we're getting. We're going to lose that, and it's just a no-brainer for them which way to go then, because it might make sense to reform policies because it gives you all of this harm reduction potential. But at the end of the day, your hands are tied because you need the resources to maintain security for their.
And could I ask, you're thinking about external political influence from places like the US. How do you? Because you obviously don't pay attention to that, which seems to me a very good approach.
I'm a policymaker, and I work with government and Ministry of Health, so obviously it's very difficult for me to delve in politics. But the authority and our head of state gives us technical people is to write policies, so to say. So obviously I'm a little bit oblivious in the challenges with America and other, how they persuade other countries to do policies. So when we get a go ahead from our head of state and say, hey doc, create policy for your government, for us, we go ahead and do that. So I'm not very in tune with, so to say, international policy.
So you don't look at the other countries, which I think is a very good point, because it's your country, so it's up to you how you do it. So, for example, what we had a lot of time that the Ministry of Health in Congo used that ICD, but the ICD says this, so we cannot do this, etc. And then if you actually read it, then it was basically the opposite. So that they were giving out a hand, and we had that secret letter in December of 2024, in which the ICD said, well, it's up to you. But I think, and I can only speak for myself, what I learned or what I see in Congo is that they don't dare. They are still afraid that the whole thing with cannabis is like, but it used to be a drug. And for them it still is. And And I'm speaking to doctors, so I'm speaking to the head of CODEP, and he's they're all doctors. And I had a phone call with them 3 months ago, and I begged them. I said, "Go. What have you learned in university? Do your research. Look. You know what does Zambia do? What does Uganda do? You know, just approach is academically. Then you know, if you don't take my word, do your research. You know, just go out there, and it's like there's a no. It's like.
Just to add, as a country, we do adhere to the INC, WHO, and the convention. We do abide with those laws. But you see, before you start a business, you need to have a solid foundation. So as a doctor, we work with what we call the Medicine Substance Allied Act. That's what makes me prescribe paracetamol and all chemotherapy. So when we then had a Cannabis Act, which is an act of parliament, that gives us the courage to prescribe cannabis to patients, because I'm not supported by wishful thinking. I'm supported by an act, so nobody can sue me in my country and say, why are you discussing cannabis? Because we have an act of parliament. We have an act of parliament for industrial hemp. We have an act of parliament called the Controlled Substance Act. So that gives us power as physicians to prescribe cannabis, and also all people who have licenses to trade in cannabis, and they can go and operate, exchange money with insurance, banks. They can get loans because they're in the cannabis business, because your acts do support your
sort of
business.
Just in short, Zambia has basically said, listen, this thing we need it. How do we get it? And said, open up, let's get it done. That's quite amazing, because, for example, the Lesotho perspective was literally to generate a bit of money, so that, and then exported everything, and it didn't really have an influence in Lesotho for the Basotho. They didn't really benefit from it, because everything was cultivated and exported, but that also meant the money was exported. So there was no real local benefit, except for a couple of jobs, and that's not really what you're aiming at. I think sort of Etienne, South Africa. What do you think? I know. I think you're. Luckily, I'm a lawyer. I can. But from the South African perspective, what do you think we need to get to that sustainable African cannabis industry in South Africa?
Just to be a bit more bold, use the evidence that's there. It's all conversations have been had, the conferences, it's been done. It's finding the world to really commit to something that is actually quite obvious. And again, just tying back to being in a room with those people and seeing how they're kind of looking at each other for guidance, and for someone to take, to make the first move. As soon as you see the movements happening at places like Zambia, for example, you got to wonder now how soon until the next domino starts falling, the next one. So again, being that first to market, first to policy reform, first to making it a real change for people, and building human capital at the end of the day. And getting on track with sustainable development and all those things, and building stronger institutions at the end of the day, right? We have this probably not first mover, but although we could probably be first movers in terms of real, like, broad policy reform, and it's there. And the fact that everybody's looking at everybody means they're also looking at us. And if we do it, we could set a new standard for Africa, which could be good news for Africa again, and we formalize that under a body like the African Union. And again, the influence you could exert then again at the UN level, for example, change policy and influence the whole world. But you see where I'm going with this. Much potential, and it's about being bold and just being decisive. And we've got the capacity, we've got the knowledge, we've got everything we need, I think.
Well, look, it's clear from Zambia, the head of state says, listen, give it to the guys that know what they're doing.
I'm pretty good at that.
But now, Neil, I'm going to put you on the spot. you've obviously got experience in a couple of African countries. From a European perspective,
Yeah.
what do you think? Do you think Europe will be acceptable if Africa as a whole pulls together and says, listen, you guys, we know you want what we can cultivate, but we're going to have to reach compromise on certain standards. Do you think Europe will be open for that if Africa does a collective?
Yeah, I mean, I should say, speaking from the UK, where we have
The most backward country in the world on the topic.
I mean, in terms of, well, exactly. The UK is now a model example of drug policy, sadly. So now, I mean, I think when things are done on that kind of collective scale, I think that, the arguments do become stronger. I think if there was a big wide Africa push to push it at the EU to maybe look at the how it might then look at the imports and this kind of thing. I think there would be a moral weight anyway, to how that could link to, especially linking that to sort of sustainable livelihoods. And I suppose it does depend on how much more change there will be in European context as well. Like the German kind of change recently, but how much wider reform there might be within the EU as a whole. Thinking about laws related to consumption in the EU. So I think it would probably take time, and the EU, I think, is quite a slow moving body in many ways. But I think, like a concerted push, if things develop in that way, it would certainly be a moral weight there.
That might even convince the DRC to also jump in.
Yeah, let's take some explanation, but convincing.
Yeah, I think just to add to that, since we're getting into the EU framework side of things, like you said, they were quite slow moving, and as people have been saying during the symposium as well, South Africa loves to overregulate and regulate things to death, right? And we learned that from Europe. It's kind of a cultural thing that's sort of been inherited. And just to sort of add to the answer to your question, I think that change will be quite slow because they love regulating.
Yes.
And because of how
you sound like a Brexiteer.
What I'm driving towards is how the European Union is composed, right?
Yeah.
It's so decentralized that getting consensus to change something like EU standards, EU GMP or whatever, right? It's a slow-going process if it ever happens.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, though it's very, it's based in the moral arguments and based in welfare and social democracy and all that stuff. At the end of the day, they've now built a system through regulation that for public health and safety, obviously, but where it gets difficult to pivot into a different direction if they want to actually adopt a new standard or enable people more. So it's actually become a bit of a beast instead of becoming something that actually really supports livelihoods and
I did just I mentioned it yesterday on the panel. I'm Brett Ryerson from Uganda, but I worked for years with the World Food Program trying to change the Common Agricultural Policy, the CAP, of the EU, because it absolutely screws African farmers. Maybe I'm just like the UK in terms of don't copy the drug policy, but whatever we were doing, zero traction on something that affected, not a billion people, but hundreds and hundreds of millions of people. And it was just absolute stonewall, European Union, the non-tariff barriers to protect their own agriculture. And that was with the weight of all of Africa's smallholder farmers and an organization like the World Food Program. I'm not bubbling with enthusiasm or optimism that the cannabis lobby could come together and change policies within the European Union. I'm not so sure that's our best use of time.
For sure.
Unfortunately, it seems we actually reached our time.
Conference said, from the space that I come from, I've always found it a little bit interesting that we have this kind of commercial push that's not Afrocentric, it's Eurocentric. So what would be the best way really to establish an African basic standards in line with GMP and GACP, where we're not beholden to the EU standards, but that we can still compete in international markets? But also the question then comes in, do we have to commercialize to compete internationally only?
Yeah, well, I think
Ask the Zambians.
I was just going
Yeah,
to
ask
say,
the Zambians.
Zambia, it was, also, what's your sort of response to that question in light of Zambia's approach?
So we do have regulators, okay, in the medical space that keep standards in terms of manufacturing of drugs. We do have local manufacturers that once they manufacture, we can then validate those commodities, and we then distribute to our hospitals and clinics across Zambia. That means we can self-regulate and administer to our own population and create our own market. So there's no need to, so to say, to rush to Europe and obviously follow standards which are difficult to meet, so to say. But we already have our own standards. We have our bureaus of standards in each and every country. SACRA, Zambra, and we have also other bureaus of standards that make sure that our population do not get intoxicated with the foods
What's
we eat.
wrong with that?
With the foods we eat, and we have all those biosafety measures. So, for instance, if you produce any substance, we have the compliance standard, Euro standard that vets, So, for instance, cannabis, if you're a local grower and say you want to go into the medical cannabis space, we have parameters in Zambia that say, okay, your certificate of analysis, do you have heavy metals in your oils? Do you have lead? Do you have mercury? Do you have arsenic? That we know as much as you can take it can give you liver failure and kidney failure. So we already have the standard and the modus operandi in our system. So we just have to utilize that. Yeah.
So do you have standards just on the final product? Or is it throughout the whole production and cultivation process? Because again, what is important is the safety and efficacy, right? The end consumer, is there a danger to them? Is there is the medicine going to do what it's supposed to do? So the role of the whole seed to sale is that regulated or guided in any way, or do you just look at the final product and say, I've got the COA, this thing is clean, there are no poisons, there are no heavy metals, I've got the potency, you're good to use it. How do you do it?
I love what you say, seed to sell. So before you start any project, you need to create a base. So let's talk of what grain parameters you're going to have. So we already have created standards of procedure, SOPs, which then speak to all the challenges you have mentioned. So if you're going to produce a final product, obviously the beginning has to be correct for you to have a clean COA. So if you're going to do it on the ground, you have to test your soil, the waters, and everything. So in every industry, we have what we call SOP standards, operating procedures. So if you're going to get a license, we are going to review as a board. You have the correct SOPs and you meet those standards. So that at the end of when you have your final product, we want it to pass. So that's why we have a board.
Ladies and
Can't we
gentlemen,
just all do what Zambia is doing?
yeah,
I was just you're an Australian politician because we Australians need to do what Zambia does.
in closing, thank you for Zambia for opening all of the rest of our eyes. And to you gentlemen, thank you very much for your time, and ladies and gentlemen, thanks a million for joining us. Highly appreciated. Thank you.